Welcome to American Medieval, a podcast about the fact that if the United States has never been truly modern, it's probably because we've always been a little bit medieval. I'm your host, Professor Matthew Gabriele, and I've been researching, teaching, and talking about the Middle Ages, well, to anyone who will listen at least, for more than 3 decades. Each week on the show, we'll be joined by an expert scholar who will share their fascination with, and sometimes their revulsion by, both the medieval world itself as well as the ways the historical period has been remembered and used right here in the USA. Welcome back to American Medieval, and on this episode, we are joined by the amazing Dr. Rachel Schine. Dr. Schine is an assistant professor of Arabic and history at the University of Maryland at College Park. Also the author of the really wonderful book, Black Knights, Arabic Epic and the Making of Medieval Race. Welcome, Rachel.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Fantastic. Thank you. I'm really excited about this conversation. I mean, you and I have kind of known each other for a while now. We've had lots of conversations, but to be able to kind of dig into this and reveal kind of all of the things that I don't know about this period is going to be, I'm really excited about that. So, which is basically, I mean, this is what this podcast as an exercise is my incompetence. So welcome.
As should all learning endeavors be. So
Indeed. I mean, like revealing your kind of vulnerability before the sources, I think that's the mark of a true humanities scholar. At least that's what I tell myself. So get me through the nights. Anyway, so welcome to the show. As we do on the episodes, is that if you will indulge me, I have kind of a silly question that I like to start with. It's silly, I think, because it involves time machines.
Okay.
And as people who study the past, anybody who studies the past, I think, has to kind of confront the question of time machines. We sometimes get asked this at parties or at social gatherings or something like that. But ours is a little bit different. So let's imagine for a moment that there is a time machine, and this time machine has a one-use limit and has been presented to you, return and back, I should say, so you're not stuck anywhere, but return and back, and that machine has been presented to you, Rachel, with the caveat that you have to go back and tell a younger version of yourself, a childhood Rachel Schine, that you will someday grow up to study in some way the Middle Ages broadly conceived.
Okay.
How does young Rachel respond to that news?
Oh, it depends on how young Rachel is.
Okay.
If young Rachel is in middle school even, I think she responds with relative unsurprise.
Okay. All right. So she's expecting this. All
Yeah,
right.
well, because already by then, I went to an elementary school where they exposed us to a second language fairly early. That second language was Spanish. I always loved my Spanish teachers, loved my Spanish classes, and was convinced that it wasn't so much that I loved Spanish as that I loved studying other languages and also learning about parts of the world that I fantasized about going to.
Okay.
For some reason, this metastasized, though, in middle school into me taking Latin of all things, which has nothing to do with studying a living global culture, unless you're going to go to Vatican City, of course. No knocks to Vatican City. It's a beautiful place.
It is a beautiful place, sure, yeah.
But I sort of became increasingly linguistically omnivorous throughout middle and high school. And so I don't think from the standpoint of, oh, she wants to read old tomes with either dead languages or languages that have radically changed over time would be that mystifying to me.
Okay.
The thing that would maybe be a bit more mystifying would be Arabic, but even then, I think I could probably get there with a little bit of intuition at that age.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So it was kind of languages. And it's interesting, too, that you say, like, it kind of depends when that question, because I purposely leave that open and everybody kind of has like an age in their head that they're thinking when I ask that.
Mm-hmm.
And also, it's also very revealing. A lot of the people that I ask, they're like, either it's, oh, yeah, I'm totally unsurprised, like I would be a medievalist, or it's like, I would cry. If you told young me that I would do this, like I would be crying because I would have thought I was going to do something else in some way.
Interesting. What's the most disparate career you've gotten that somebody thought was going to be their alternate reality? I'm just curious.
I would have to think back, but I think that it might be mine, which is that I thought, and I've mentioned this on previous episodes before, but like I thought I was going to play first base for the New York Yankees.
Hell yeah.
Through most of childhood. And then that transitioned to, playing midfield for like some professional soccer team at some point when I kind of switched gears. But then I realized like, A, I couldn't hit a curveball, and B, I was never going to be kind of athletic or talented enough to play like professional soccer. So then I kind of transitioned into kind of more academics or something like that. So
wait, sorry, I have a follow-up though, because I realize I'm not supposed to be interviewing.
I love that tables have turned here on this podcast. This is great. Yeah.
Turnabout is fair play. You opened yourself up to this by making a podcast.
1,000%. Yes.
So, okay, if you're interest was originally in, like, the actual athleticism, like, doing of the thing. Did you ever
Mhm.
decide to sort of turn that into studying the doing of the thing? Like, have you looked at sports culture and leisure in the Middle Ages?
Not in the Middle Ages, but in kind of modern political culture and in
Ooh.
fact, that's really interesting actually. Like, wow, I feel like I'm on the couch now. This is great. This is what being a guest on a podcast is like. It's amazing. I should do this more often.
Wait, can I just do I get to do this for the rest of it now? Because I stole the ball, so it's in my court. Is this am I offside? I don't know
Well,
how sports ball works.
I have my tricks to regain kind of the conch, as it were, of this Lord of the Flies-esque inquisition that I'm being subjected to right now. So I entered college as an undergraduate thinking I wanted to be an anthropologist, archaeologist specifically,
Mm,
because I really didn't know, but I thought like, oh, that kind of sounds interesting. I took a few anthropology courses. I realized like this just isn't for me. This is not what I thought it was going to be. So the next semester, my spring semester, my freshman year, I took just a bunch of kind of gen ed courses, liberal arts courses. And one of them was Intro to Sociology, which I really liked, but I ended up writing, to go back to your question, I wrote a research paper on football hooliganism or football kind of fan culture. So
nice.
it wasn't about kind of the athleticism of it, but it was about kind of the reception of the sport, which in the early 90s, right, there was a real problem, right, with kind of football hooliganism and stuff like that.
Right.
So I thought that was kind of interesting. That ended up being kind of put to the side, but that is the stuff that I am still very interested in is about kind of cultures around fandom and stuff like that. And now that you say this, actually in my first book, I make an analogy between the difference between history and memory
Mhm.
to fandoms of the New York Yankees and the Boston Red Sox.
Oh, interesting.
Sports have always been kind of part of my language of how I try to communicate, especially to wider audiences.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yes. So back to you though.
Oh, no.
Oh no.
Okay.
All right, so your interest in languages, if I'm understanding you correctly, kind of pulled you into not necessarily the medieval world specifically, but just kind of exploring kind of different cultures and stuff like that.
Mhm.
And then you mentioned like Arabic being something not necessarily in middle school use mind, but then being introduced to you. So what introduced you to Arabic, got you interested in that language and those cultures?
Right, yeah. I don't want to say that it was a careerist move because I don't think that I, as a 16 or 17-year-old, had an idea of a career in my head that was fully formed, but
Sure.
there was certainly a strategic element to it in the sense that by the time that I was finishing high school, starting to think about colleges, I knew on the basis of my interest in languages and other cultures that I wanted opportunities to have a job that would let me see the world.
Hmm.
I literally did not have a passport until I was a junior in college about to go on study abroad.
Okay.
I was not from a family that traveled internationally, both because of means and interest, and I was the weirdo who wanted to.
Sure.
And so I figured, well, okay, if I wanna see the world, then I have to, keep doing the languages thing because most people in the world do not speak English, although that is increasingly the global Anglophone is, of course, a thing. And then secondly, I need to have some kind of inside knowledge that other people don't have about how the world works,
Mm. Hmm.
because that's the skill set that will let me be able to do a job that involves the world. So I convinced myself that the combination of factors there that would work really well was doing a degree in political science
Okay.
with a focus on international relations because that's how the world works, right? Is
Yep.
nations relating to each other. Wrong, but we'll get to that later. And that changed a lot while I was in college for various reasons. And secondarily, I said, Arabic is, first of all, I grew up in the media culture around the Middle East being in a zone of interest for the United
Hmm.
States. Spoken in over 20 countries, is a language with a long history, is a language that's related to another language that I have some purchase in, i.e. Hebrew. And I've always thought that Islamic art and architecture were cool. When I took an art history class in high school, that was by far the most interesting chapter in the book to me. It says a lot that that was only one chapter, by the way.
Yes. Yes.
And so I said, okay, I'm going to start studying Arabic. So the summer before I went to college, I actually signed up for a basically Arabic phonics class where we learned
Okay.
alif, bet, the alphabet, and some basic writing and reading skills so that when I matriculated into college and signed up for Arabic at the 100 level, I had about a 3-week lead on everybody else.
Okay.
Because that's what learning the alphabet in another language will get you, basically.
Sure. Yeah.
So I came in feeling very confident, of course, but that was quickly dispensed with. So the Arabic continued to follow me throughout college. The political science strain of this changed significantly, and I can talk about that
Mhm.
if you want me to.
Please do.
Yeah, so I ended up still graduating from Williams College, loved my 4 years there, absolutely
Mhm.
beautiful place. If you don't know it, now you know it, with a degree still in political science and Arabic studies. Arabic studies became a major right when I was about to declare a major, so that was
Okay.
a marriage of convenience, which yay. The political science degree had multiple tracks that were possible. One was international relations, one was comparative politics, and one was
Mhm.
political theory.
Sure.
I bounced between all 3 and ultimately settled on political theory basically because it was a philosophy degree in
Mhm.
disguise,
Mhm.
and so I just got to read good books by people with big brains who kind of scared me and who I didn't quite understand.
Mhm.
And cracking into that actually gave me a basis in theory that served me really well for graduate school, unexpectedly,
Mhm.
and also turned on my interest in being able to sort of think about how to take historically contingent phenomena, or linguistically or philologically, I didn't know that word in undergrad, but philologically contingent phenomena, and place them into larger models of thought and larger conversations.
Mhm.
So it was a really good way of helping me to navigate between the 2 degrees, even though I didn't really recognize it as such at the time. I'm very glad that I accidentally fell
Sure,
into
yeah,
it,
yeah.
but it was very much falling backwards.
Yeah. There's something I think incredibly valuable sometimes too about coming to a topic obliquely is not like, you lose out. So all of my degrees are in history,
Mhm.
though I have for a long time taught in a department of religion. And like talking with my religious studies colleagues, as I've kind of adapted over the 20 years that I've been here now at Virginia Tech, is I bring a different lens to some of those conversations. And some of those are very narrow and blinkered because like I understand historiography, I understand a certain approach, a methodology, approach to the past and approach to sources and stuff like that. But then I can play when I'm talking with my theory friends here is to say like, well, I'm just a simple historian. Like, I don't understand this. Like, what if we thought about it in this way? And they can push back in really interesting ways, bringing different approaches. Like, well, why aren't you thinking about it like kind of like this?
Mm.
And I think those are productive conversations, not that I'm trying to do it all myself, but like I'm being pushed to think about it in different ways. So coming out of political science and then being kind of different disciplines or different kind of set of disciplines, then I think that's probably very useful, right?
Yeah, it's nice to hear you describe its use cases because I used to joke with people when they would ask me about my degrees and I would say Arabic and political science and they would make the immediate intuitive leap to what I had originally begun with, which is, oh, she wants to do something with contemporary IR and contemporary geopolitics.
Yeah.
I'd say, no, I got the most useless version of both degrees because by the end I was focused on classical Arabic in the Arabic studies program,
Yeah.
and by the end I was focused on political theory and reading their version of ancient tomes, basically, in the
Hmm.
political science program.
Yeah.
So having you describe it as having utility is kind of mind-blowing to me.
This is what I'm here for. This is one of the
Yay.
many services we provide here at American Medieval is finding utility in things. And two, like I think that for myself, I came out of a relatively theory friendly kind of graduate program, which is unusual for history degrees, I will say. Like historians just always go to the archive and they just kind of eschew theory, like they just don't want to think about it.
Mm.
And I think that boxes us in sometimes, especially in pre-modern societies where sources can be thin on the ground. And I think increasingly, probably, and this is kind of a separate conversation, in the modern society in which we're living in a digital age in which sources are disappearing very, very rapidly, or in political situations in which sources are hidden
Mhm.
and so not available to people, then theory becomes even more kind of useful and important there. So when you're talking about kind of in the pre-modern world, in the pre-modern kind of Islamic world, like how does theory kind of inform your work there? Like it's not that, you've read X whatever as a junior in Williams College, like maybe you have, but then,
Mhm.
like, oh, that explains everything about this thing. But like, how does that help us understand in your specific cases, like what people's lives were or what a text was saying in the periods that you study?
That's a really good question. I think of theory as kind of doing 2 things. One of them is maybe ironic for people who have that sort of innate allergy to theory, which is that it's
Mm,
a communication device. Which if you think of theory as being continental and opaque, and why are all of these Frenchmen talking about deconstruction and all this sort of stuff,
mhm,
um, you might say this is not an effective communication device because it is kind of written in an impenetrable way and doing things with language that are self-consciously inverting the way that we think of linguistic norms and communication norms. But what I mean by that is theory is almost always concerned with modeling things that speak to both the time in which the theory is composed and also can be transported and used to speak to
Mm.
other times and other situations as well. And in that sense, it gives you a potential bridge.
Okay.
So when, for example, I talk about using things like critical theories of race and ethnicity to talk about the past, that's not me saying that everything that happened in the Islamicate past is definitively something that we could map onto a contemporary Euro-American idea of race or ethnicity, but rather the theory helps us talk about what's going on there in a way that we can access over here. So first of all, it's a communication device, and then second of all, it is something that lets us do that kind of modeling and comparison.
Mm.
So I think of theory as not a tool for very often, for some reason, and I think this happens early on, you get taught that theory is a lens through which to see the source. That's not usually how I think about it. I think about
Mm.
it more as theorist over here. Like, let's imagine him or her or them having a conversation with source over here. What would that conversation look like? And that includes situations where they are disagreeing and there is friction.
Sure.
And then how do I, if I'm moderating that conversation, navigate that friction or get over it? And if I can't get over it, then it's probably not a good, viable conversation. And then maybe you have to pick a different set of partners.
Mhm.
But I think that the idea that theory is the lens through which or the prism through which to see the source and read, like, eisegetically or something like that is sometimes how it's stated, and it's kind of misleading. I also don't think it's really how historians operate when they're working with theory,
Yeah.
because we want to live in the gray areas.
I like your mention of friction,
Yeah,
especially because there's no theory that's immediately applicable to every context and every situation, and it would be a very poor theorist who would ever explicitly suggest that, right?
yeah,
But I think that it is often taken, especially by, as you were saying, people who are allergic to theory, which is a good way of putting it, right? Is that's how it's supposed to be thought. But it's a helpful way of thinking with those sources. So have there been particular theorists that you have found particularly useful kind of in the work that you've been doing?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, so many.
Yes.
Maybe I'll talk about a current project that I'm working on,
Sure.
which is in revision stages, so I don't know if it's gonna see the light of day anytime soon, but it's been sort of tickling my brain. So
Mhm.
Jennifer L. Morgan,
Okay.
who is a professor, I believe, at NYU, of the Atlantic world and studies Atlantic world slavery, has a wonderful book called Reckoning with Slavery. And Reckoning is in the title because it's about the ways in which, as the Atlantic world was being opened, as racial capitalism was evolving, one of the things that, of course, is a companion to that is numeracy, is thinking about
Mm.
demographic sciences, is thinking about bookkeeping, is thinking about how do you not just commodify people, because that's, of course, what enslavement is, but
Yeah.
record that commodification, fix value, assess value, appraise what you're doing.
Oh. Yeah, yeah.
And her way of thinking about, the history of racial capitalism as a history of thinking with numeracy has been really compelling for me because there is a set of traditions in the Islamic context that get crystallized into a genre that's sometimes referred to as futuh or maghazi. Futuh literally means openings because this is how conquests were referred to in the early Islamic period. You're opening a
Okay.
new terrain to the possibility of receiving Islam. Maghazi, much more sort of straightforwardly, comes from a base word that means raiding,
Mm.
so making war on your neighbors or people out in the peripheries. And in those traditions, very often, numbers of armies, numbers of captives, like, they're very
Oh.
concerned with demography
Yeah.
at sort of a basic level, but this is something that historians have often been very skeptical of because the numbers are typically kind of, freewheelingly inflated,
Yes.
or at least
Yes.
that's what people have said is, you look at, like, these I think one historian refers to them as some like whoppers of numbers of people on the Byzantine side being so massive, and then the Muslim side being this little band of underdogs or whatever it is, and
Yeah.
then you hear about this glorious victory, and it all the more enhances this idea of divine certitude in the mission.
Sure.
But what I find very interesting within that is certain agreements that were made in the Bilad Sudan, or so-called lands of the Black, so basically Sahelian and Sub-Saharan Africa, and also the portions of Upper Egypt that we now call Nubia, that entailed not just peace treaties, but also tribute agreements for enslaved persons, which tended to
Mm.
stipulate a number. And that number across all of them is actually fairly uniform. And I was like, okay, so how do I think about numeracy with numbers that may or may not be true, that certainly are symbolic, that are doing narrative work, but that are also doing the work of commodifying people or
Sure,
exploiting
yeah.
economies that existed prior that involve the trade in persons. And so she's been super, super cool to work with and think with. I'm not working with her in person, obviously, work with her brain, such as
Yeah.
she laid it out on paper. Um, and I highly encourage people to, yeah.
That's really interesting. So Jennifer Morgan, NYU. So that's really interesting that the kind of dichotomy that you're kind of pointing to, in which, if I'm understanding you correctly, is that there's a concern about precision in the one case, right?
Mhm.
About like you owe us a certain number of enslaved persons as tribute, but there's also absolutely a concern, but not necessarily a concern about accuracy in these portrayals of armies and other sort of kind of in maybe not necessarily always narrative sources, but those types of sources. So I'm wondering, are you thinking kind of, is that an issue of genre? But I do want to kind of back up because you've been talking about kind of enslaved persons. And so, and I don't know that a lot of times our listeners and people who think about the Middle Ages, both in the kind of Latin Christian and the Byzantine East, and certainly in the Islamic world as well, they don't think about a world of enslavement, but it really was, wasn't it? Like, so could you talk a little bit about kind of like slavery or enslaved persons kind of generally?
Yeah, absolutely. So suffice it to say that virtually every society ruled by Muslims or Christians, or in the very few cases where this is true, Jews in the medieval context,
Mhm.
had enslavement. They had systems of enslaving certain types of people. Usually, for example, most of these religions banned the enslavement of your co-religionists. Whether or not that always actually occurred on the ground is another interesting question. I can talk about
Mhm.
people who've worked on that one. The systems of enslavement often took into consideration variables like gender or age of the enslaved, things like who was, from various cultural perspectives, most fit for different kinds of work. So there was often an ethnic or an ethno-racial granulation of who we are enslaving and why.
Mhm.
And there was also a significant set of textual justifications or corroborating materials on which people could draw to explain the conditions of enslavement, both from a legalistic perspective and from a theological perspective, in the sense that the Quran, the Bible, all of these texts have some prescriptions on what enslavability and enslavement look like.
Mhm.
So Islam arises in the 6 through 700s, basically, in the Arabian Peninsula, in a world system where it is sort of bordered by the Axumites of Ethiopia down in the Red Sea area, the Byzantines further north and to their west, and the Sasanians to their east. This is a world system that often people refer to as sort of a late antique world system in terms of periodization. All of these groups of people had enslavement.
Yeah.
So it's just kind of, on the one hand, par for the course, on the other hand, therefore something that is a historical reality with which historians must grapple.
Yeah. One of the interesting things too, and then I want to get back to kind of the genre question or the numeracy question, maybe more specifically, is it's been a benefit of kind of social history generally, or just thinking about people who aren't kind of the elites and being concerned and realizing that there are many varieties of kind of unfreedom, as I think some scholars are have been saying over the last number of years, even in medieval Latin Europe, right? Like David and I, when we were writing the Bright Ages, like when we talked about the Vikings, like we made sure to emphasize, like in the case of the Norse societies, like that was a slave economy, and
Mhm.
it functioned based on the fact that people were bought and sold and taken, and horrible things were done to them, and that's kind of how a lot of everything functioned. But one of the things that I think we missed in that book, or sometimes historians do, by focusing on one of those groups in medieval Europe, for example, it leaves out all the other groups that were doing that as well.
Mhm.
It wasn't occurring in a vacuum that the Vikings were kind of weird in that way. So I like your emphasis on saying that this was just the way that the world operated, was putting people into these situations, oftentimes, as you said initially, kind of by conquest, right? Like finding people who are other than you, bringing them in, and then forcing them into labor and or servitude in some kind of way.
Yeah, absolutely. And because in some ways Islam is the youngest of these systems in the late antique complex, it places different guardrails on slavery than some of these other cultures have. So, for example, I
Okay.
believe, and you can tell me if this is wrong because I don't know very much about the Norse, I believe they have a version of debt slavery, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
Okay, so that is not permitted in Muslim contexts. You cannot sell yourself into indenture or slavery, for example.
Yeah.
And that is partly because of the enslavement and co-religionist issue, but it's also partly because of how understandings of debt and accrual of interest and things like that work. It's a long story. And in addition, it opens up possibilities that maybe aren't as entrenched in other cultural contexts. So, for example, there's not widespread concubinage in certain Western Christian societies. However,
Mhm.
there is concubinage in Muslim societies. At the same time, one of the provisions of concubinage, so if you basically have a woman who is enslaved in your home, you, the male owner, have sexual access to her in addition to access to her labor. If she has a child for you, that child becomes born into your lineage, not hers. There's no partus sequitur ventrem equivalent in the Islamic context.
Yeah.
They are therefore born into freedom, born into the inheritance plan of the male head of house, and the mother becomes something called walad, mother of the child, that says that she can neither be sold away from the home nor gifted and is freed upon the owner's death.
Oh, okay.
So there was a upward mobility mechanism sort of through concubinage that you don't see in other societies even that have it.
Yeah.
At the same time, there are people who will make arguments for, okay, so when Islam arose, because there were all of these incentives toward manumission, both in structures like Walad that evolved from the legal sort of jurisprudential context, and also through the Quranic precedent in the Sunnah, or the behaviors of the Prophet Muhammad as they are followed and understood by people who were witness to them, that incentivize manumission. Things like the way that you expiate murder is by freeing a believing slave, or the way that you expiate not being able to go on Hajj or something like that. There are all these instances where people will say, oh, well, if you free one of your slaves, then that sort of can help to wipe away aspects of sin or aspects of criminal behavior or whatever it might be.
Mhm.
There were sort of fundamentals in the early Islamic context that seeded a sort of long path to abolition of slavery. This, of course, is not a path that anybody talks about seriously or actualizes on until the 19th century, as
Yeah.
in most cultures around the world, because,
Yeah,
again,
yeah.
tracking with world systems. But that is one of the arguments that people make. And on the other hand, you have people who make the contrasting argument, which is the sort of political economic one of, okay, but if you have societies that have slavery, and in those societies that have slavery, you have fairly wide berth for manumission, and manumission often occurs, then that creates a downward pressure where you also have a demand for the intake of slaves at the bottom that's fairly consistent.
That's the kind of the tension, right? I think is that, and this sort of goes back to our conversation about theory, is that all of these conversations about pre-modern societies are colored by modern concerns, right?
Mhm.
Is that is thinking about like, okay, what am I trying to say about in this specific case, like kind of Islam generally, and if I say something about slavery, like does that reflect on modern Islam or contemporary politics or something like that? And that's true about Europe, right? As well, is that I think one of the reasons that we oftentimes, or at least for historians for a very long time, didn't want to talk about unfreedoms within medieval Europe as slaves is because Europe didn't do that,
Yeah.
right? Like it was an early modern invention that was kind of brought to them kind of externally. And yeah, they did it and that was bad, but then they were, they freed everybody and everything was kind of hunky dory and they held hands and everything was kind of great. So not true, actually. Not true. Yes.
Right. Yeah, don't you love how everybody has the capacity to blame shift? So it's like, "Oh, no, we got this from the neighbors. No, we got this from the neighbors. No," and by the end, it's just circular and
Exactly.
everybody's saying, "No, this was brought to us in early modernity by X."
It's like a historical MLM or something like that, right? It's
Yeah.
just like it's a pyramid scheme. It's just gonna like eventually it'll collapse because
Yeah.
eventually it'll just come back. Like the blame will like go around the world and then back
Mhm.
back to wherever it kind of started, and then the whole facade will collapse. Hasn't happened yet, but we'll
Yeah.
we'll see. So
No, and this is why one of the other theorists who I look to a lot, although I think he'd find it funny that I'm calling him a theorist, so maybe he'd bristle at that. But one of the other historians who does a lot of theoretical thinking that I look to a
mhm.
lot is David Nuremberg, who has a wonderful essay on the abortive nature of the quest for origins when
Mhm.
studying concepts that are as flexible, mutable, and yet relatively universal as racialization, for example.
Yeah.
He just pronounces on this so effectively, where he's just like, the role of the historian is to look at things that we can say with certitude happened in different places, think about them carefully, but not necessarily to try to say, "This is the first time that this happened definitively," or declare that that is, stake out the turf, as it were,
Yeah.
because A, someone's gonna come along and prove you wrong, and B, if enough people keep trying to do that, then eventually you get to a cumulative point, and he doesn't quite say this, but I think this is sort of, where I'm taking it.
Yeah.
You get to a cumulative point where you kind of arrive at a solipsism of nothing is new under the sun and everything is like ancient beyond measure, and then you have to grapple with what is prehistory, which is
Yeah.
also an ugly weirdness that nobody wants to actually deal with except people who do study it directly.
Yeah.
And then you're not really saying anything about history itself. You're making a philosophical point about your take on human nature
Mhm.
that is highly subjective.
Yeah, I mean, like origin points have become incredibly tricky, especially for ideas and concepts, like as you were saying, because you can go into that thing where there's nothing new under the sun because everything has happened before or something like that. But then the other thing too, which I think is complementary to it, like if everything is the first time, then nothing is the first time,
Yes.
right? So it's just like, well, it's different because of this, or it's different because of that. In my own kind of research, which often intersects with the idea of the Crusades, right? Like instances of Christian holy war,
Mhm.
like everybody keeps kind of pushing it back or saying like, oh, this thing that happened in 1095, this is different than what happened in 1074 for this reason. It's different than the thing that happened in 1064. It's just like because of this thing that happened later, but then we can read back and see that was happening here. It's just like, what are we doing here? Like, I don't know what is this kind of getting us there? And I don't have a great answer for that yet, but maybe somebody will come up with one. So I don't know.
Let's hope.
Let's hope so. Just a reminder to check out one of my favorite other podcasts, This Guy Sucked, another sibling show on Multitude. It's a history podcast for haters by haters. Join historian Dr. Claire Alban and a new expert every week to see why no dead person is safe. Everyone from Charlemagne to James II to Phyllis Schlafly. They all sucked in their own way. New episodes every Thursday. Check it out now. So another thing too is that you mentioned too, and I know this was a focus of your first book, Black Knights, was about kind of issues of racialization,
Mhm.
because I think that this has also been contested within medieval studies, but also and obviously in kind of modern societies, like the history of race is a concept, and oftentimes I think people who do have a passing knowledge about the pre-modern world, the medieval Europe, the Mediterranean, the Islamicate world, and things like that, is that people didn't think in issues of race. Is that you have the far right kind of canard that Europe was a solely white kind of Christian space, not true in any way, shape, or form, but also that these societies didn't think about kind of skin color in any real way. So could you tell us like a little bit more, like what attracted you to that question, and like how did medievals kind of think about race?
Yeah, absolutely.
Just a small, tiny little question.
Yeah, it's minuscule, really.
Yeah,
I'll take only a few words to answer it.
good.
So I think we might have talked about this before, but I basically say that I arrived at this question through the sources and through my
Mm.
inability to read them without asking it and taking it seriously,
Hmm.
rather than because of where I sensed the field was going or conversations that were happening around me. It was really a matter of I sat down with the text that I thought I was going to write my dissertation on, thinking it would be a very different dissertation,
Mm.
and came across a part of the story. And I should say the text that I wrote my dissertation on is an Arabic epic. I can talk about what that means in a second if you want me to, called Sirat al-Amira That al-Himma. Sira is a word that's often translated as epic, but it basically means a life path or a journey. The most popular version of a sira is the Sira Nabawiyya set of traditions, or the life of the Prophet Muhammad, but they become a genre unto themselves throughout the Middle Ages of popular collective composition of heroic cycles that usually focus on heroes
Mm.
from particular tribes or particular venues of frontier warriorship. So Amira is the general/princess. People have translated either way. She is the leader of an army, though, so I think
Okay.
general is a reasonable way of putting it. That al-Himma is the laqab or nickname, nom de guerre, if you will, of this
Hmm.
female character who is the central heroine of this text, meaning possessor of ambition. So she's an elite general. She's
Yeah.
badass. And I thought that I was going to write a dissertation about basically military women and how they are construed. There are people who do that work. Rana Mikati, for example, has a wonderful article on actual historical military personages, so not narrative sources, but she
Hmm.
uses the historical ones like the Futuh literature I was talking about before. That is not where I ended up going, because there is a son that is born to this hero woman in this
Okay.
the most lengthy epic in the Arabic language. It comes to about 5,500 to 6,000 pages in modern editions. And the son, Abdul Wahab, who is tentatively linked to a historical person from the tribe of Kilab, which is the central tribe in the story. But in the historical person's life, this is not part of how he's discussed, is born black. Aswad is the word used in Arabic.
Okay.
To two parents who do not identify themselves as black. They say that they are Arab. In the text, they're also referred to as Abyad or white,
Okay.
which
Huh.
means something different in the Arabophone context than it does in the European context.
Sure. Yeah.
Again, I can talk about in a second. I keep saying that. Um, and because of his blackness, immediately his mother is accused of having sex with an enslaved person. Immediately, he has a set
Oh.
of paternity suits to litigate his legitimacy. Immediately, an explanation has to be mounted for how can he look this way and be from this family. And also this experience of being, as I posit it in my book, racialized differently from the rest of his family,
Yeah.
structures his lived experience throughout the rest of the story. He becomes the head of Al-Umara Sudan, black generals in the army who he oversees, who have black regiments, who are from not the Arabian Peninsula, but from places like Abyssinia.
Oh.
So he's not even hanging out with, by the end, a cohort of people who are Arab even after his legitimacy is certified. He's sort of the go-between across that cultural
Mm-hmm.
and social line. And so you could look at this as, oh, he's born darker skinned than the rest of his family. This is a colorist instance. But scholars of colorism basically say that you don't have a concern about differentials in skin color without either class or race differences or both being part of society, because why are you concerned about looking swarthier than the rest of your family? Well, either it's because you're viewed as a menial or because you're viewed as a foreigner or both.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was like, okay, so I can't answer it that way,
Yeah.
but can I talk about it racially? And I sort of looked around for sources on how to do so. And in the context of Islamic history that far back, your one guy who had written anything about this really of significance was Bernard Lewis, and that was a little sus.
Yikes. Yeah.
And meanwhile, when I looked to other contemporaneous cultures, because the Siras start being textualized in the 12th century, basically.
Oh yeah. Oh sure. Yeah.
So when I looked at other contemporaneous cultures, say what was going on in the medieval Latin West, there was a significant and growing portion of researchers who were taking this question of racialization in the deeper past seriously.
Mm-hmm.
They were taking it seriously from the perspective of Western Europe. They were often trying to ask that question that you asked sort of at the start of this of like, European whiteness doesn't come out of nowhere. So how far back can we go?
Yeah.
Um, but of course, that's a different thing than what I wanted to ask, but there was a body of literature and a group of interlocutors, so I started sort of trying to have those conversations.
Mhm.
Not sure they always went very well, but I did get a dissertation out of it and then got a book out of it, and people seem to not completely hate it. So
Yeah. No, I mean, award-winning book, I should have said. So, I mean, some people do like, oh yeah, academics are too modest. Like you should be proud of the book because the book's amazing. But I mean, this epic sounds, I mean, just absolutely amazing. I'm curious if you could just speak very briefly, like kind of reception, like as far as we can
Yeah.
tell, as far as we can know about any kind of pre-modern kind of source. Like, was it well received? Was it popular? Was it read? Was it retold? Was it like adapted or anything like that? And then two, like this issue of not just the relationship of color
Mhm.
or racial difference or however we want to kind of do it, but of gender as well, right? Like, because you mentioned like this is an epic about a female general, a woman general,
Mhm.
then her son kind of enters the picture and then it shifts. Like, so how does that play into this as well, right? Like, is that because we aren't just dealing with issues of just men doing things, is that, gender is seems to play a role here as well. So,
Yeah, absolutely, and this can help me maybe get to the larger question that you asked before that I did not answer, which is how did people in the Middle Ages think about
oh, I noticed, but that's
war
fine.
on race? Um, So in terms of reception, so Sirat al-Amira That al-Himma, which is sometimes also known as Sirat al-Mujahideen or the Tale of the Pious Warriors, we know that throughout the Middle Ages in terms of density of attestation and number of manuscripts produced and things like this, and this is also partly based on the work of folks like Konrad Hirschler, who studies medieval libraries and medieval book culture,
Mhm.
and Yossi Rappaport, who has a new book out on Arab identity in the non-urban, i.e. rural, because that's the word for that, spaces,
Mhm.
in Mamluk era Egypt, basically, that That al-Himma, as well as one other epic called Sirat Antar, about a half Abyssinian general named Antara ibn Shaddad from the pre-Islamic period.
Mm,
So again, you have the fact that
yeah.
he's born into enslavement and born black being a major factor in his origin story and his rise to heroism, were two of the most popular of these epics, of which there are in the teens in terms of the sort of broader genre
Mhm.
in the Mamluk period. So Mamluk period being between the 13th and early 16th century in Egypt, Syria, and parts of Arabia. And their capital was in Cairo, and they were sort of the central power in the Islamic world until the rise of like the Ottoman Safavid Mughal
Yeah.
sort of triumvirate, if
Mhm.
you will. The story was told a lot, read from a lot, quite likely, in the process of telling, in the sense that it's
Mhm.
a multi-volume affair. Storytellers who were paid to do so would often rent a volume and recite from it in public places where people could consume this as entertainment,
Ah, okay. Yeah.
and then return the volume and rent the next one because it was so capacious that
Yeah.
basically, like, buying a whole thing of it was gonna become complicated if you were a poor storyteller. And so that culture of public storytelling endures into the era of the coffee shop.
Oh.
There are hekawetis or trained storytellers that begin to recite these stories in cafes. You can still sometimes consume this as a sort of revived folk art in certain parts of the Arab world, especially in Egypt, where things like the sira of a tribe called the tribe of Hilal, who basically moved from the Arabian Peninsula during the Fatimid period into parts of North Africa,
Mhm.
is sort of a piece of heritage that UNESCO has paid attention to, that there's funding for the revival of, and things
Oh,
like that.
wow. Okay, yeah.
But for the most part, once the coffee shops start getting TVs in them and TVs start playing soccer, so thanks a lot, people like you, has its death knell rung as a medium
Yeah.
or space in which this occurs. At the same time, these stories then end up being populated into other media, so things like
Sure.
Ramadan series or children's books, and, you can still consume them in other ways, but the art of the storyteller
Yeah.
has largely lapsed as it has in most cultures. So in other words, we know that there was a strong and consistent pattern of reception of this set of stories throughout the Middle Ages. We also know that that set of receivers would have been receiving them piecemeal in semi-literate contexts. So it's hard to say, would everyone have done what I did and read every single page of,
Yeah.
volume 3 of this, thousands of pages long thing? No.
Yeah.
But at the same time, because of the work of contemporary anthropologists of religion and anthropologists of Arab cultures like Dwight Reynolds, who is recently retired and was a professor at University of California, Santa Barbara, and is brilliant, we have recordings of people listening to these stories being told,
Hmm.
and we can kind of gauge from audience response, what stories do people, at least in the 20th century or the 21st century, seem to know from within this broader corpus. And they tend
Sure.
to know things like the stories of the births of the heroes,
Mhm.
because they're often semi-miraculous births and they set them on the path. And that's sort of, everyone loves the origin stories of the heroes, like Marvel Cinematic Universe type stuff.
Absolutely.
So I center a lot of my book, not necessarily for that reason, but because this is also the moment when the racialization literally begins, because it's a concept of heredity that's being sort of put into play, on origin stories of these heroes.
Mhm.
This is me having said before that origins are a bad way of thinking about history. Whoops. And in terms of the gendering question, of course, in order to originate a human, barring innovations in science that are always churning and very exciting, you tend to have a maternal figure involved.
This is breaking news right here on this podcast. Okay. Please
Um,
continue. Yeah.
so one of the things that has been sometimes posed as a purpose of the elevation of heroes like Antara ibn Shaddad, who, as I said before, was this pre-Islamic figure. So he's, born into, at the time, enslavement, because he's born to a mother who was enslaved and a concubine to an Arab in the story, a guy named Shaddad, who was in the tribe of Abs. He doesn't benefit from his father's tribal standing and has to sort of prove his mettle and prove his worth in order
Oh,
to be
okay.
ingratiated into the culture in the story. So one of the things that some historians early on said is, oh, people like Antara being heroes who get epics written about them later on probably has something to do with helping to legitimize children who were increasingly born out of these kinds of relationships. Probably has something to do with this being the rags to riches story that people wanted to hear,
Yeah.
where you have a child who's born into, in the case of a post-Islamic context, a household where they do indeed end up being considered legally on paper to share their father's tribal standing, to share their father's inheritance and his ethnic affiliation, whatever. But maybe they weren't as accepted
Yeah.
as the kids who were born to co-wives or as the kids who were born to people who were women in the culture. If they're born to, say, a woman from Abyssinia, i.e. modern-day Ethiopia, Eritrea, and parts of northern Somalia, who looked different from other people, who had a different cultural background, so on and so forth. So, one of the things that people have considered when it comes to these heroes and their origin stories and the emphasis, frankly, on Blackness in popular narrative in the Islamic world to a much greater degree than you see both in other genres and in other corners of the world in that sort of medieval complex that we've been talking about
Mhm.
is, oh, it must be because of these types of family arrangements. And
Mm.
it must be because there was this like critical mass of people in society who were asking these kinds of questions or feeling these kinds of ways and wanted to sort of have stories of identity that showed them to be individuals who were of worth, individuals who had achieved glory, individuals who came to the forefront of their societies. And so that's one axis of it. Another axis of it is that, of course, when you're talking about the epics, I said Sirat al-Himma is helmed by a female general. That's the only one to be titled after a woman. A lot of them have female martial personalities, but
Okay.
usually they are fronted by men like Antara.
Yeah.
You have, therefore, a type of masculinity oriented around things like pious warriorship being articulated in these stories. And that pious warriorship is something that is being valorized not just for Muslims, but for potential Muslims as a
Ah.
way of gaining social access. Because one of the things that you often see, and I talk about this a bit in my book, are allegories of assimilation, is what I call them. So basically, conversion stories where people come from these peripheries under conditions of enslavement into the world of the hero, who is, as I said before, hanging out with people mostly from places like Abyssinia who are in these regiments. Muslim societies had fairly robust structures of military enslavement that are generating these types of regiment in the first place.
Mhm.
And they'll come under the tutelage of the hero. The hero is himself a freeborn Arab man who has his legitimacy certified, but also looks like them. So he's a perfect hybrid figure
Sure.
who introduces them into the world of prayer, into the world of piety, into the world of also things like caliphal politics, and oftentimes sort of seduces them through his charisma and through his efficacy and through his tenderheartedness towards them into saying, "Hey, this looks great." And they convert.
This is all like super interesting because it's a literature I don't know anything about. I should know more about, and thanks to your book, I do know a little bit more about. But the anxieties that seem to be on display in some of these texts that you're describing, like they don't match exactly, but I think they would be useful to think with in medieval literature as well, like not just kind of Latin but vernacular, like anxieties about class, about inheritance. Because I'm thinking about the story you were telling about kind of the child who needs to prove themselves, right? Like I mean
Mhm.
that's a pretty standard trope in late medieval Latin literature, right? Like the noble who's like or like doesn't know about their noble heritage and needs to go away and then prove themselves. Like even in some Arthurian literature,
Yeah.
like that's there as well. So like issues of class too, I think kind of play into this or like seem to play into this as well. But also the anxieties of conversion in the late Middle Ages, because I think that's something that people aren't aware of when they think about the Middle Ages. They think about the Crusades and they think about it as a kind of a grand massacre, but also an act of conversion. And it's really not. Like there are exceptions to that, of course,
Mhm.
but it's really the later Middle Ages from the 12th century, really the kind of at least in Latin Europe, like the 13th century on, where there are these attempts at massive conversions. Like when I tell people, like most of Iberia didn't become fully Christian until very, very late in the Middle Ages, like early modernity, or Asia Minor didn't become predominantly Muslim until very, very late, like well after most of it had been under Islamic rule for a long time. That kind of blows their mind, so that there's literature about that at the same time too, like really seems to emphasize that, or at least kind of like show that to people who might be unfamiliar.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, on the one hand, these epics are very much staged at frontiers or thurur in the Arabic, in the sense of places that Muslims don't rule
Hmm.
and are at the hinterlands of where they rule, but where Muslims rule, they were majoritized but not the majority. And this is an important difference to
Yep.
make for people. Or just because somebody at the top is calling the shots, that doesn't mean that everybody in the land is Muslim. That doesn't mean that everybody even by half.
Yeah.
And it also doesn't mean that the Muslims who are at the top therefore feel a certain amount of what we might call now anachronistically like demographic security in their position.
Hmm.
So you have to sort of wonder, even if something's being staged at a far periphery, how much are these texts kind of inevitably talking about what's going on right under their noses? And this is again something that Yossi Rappaport talks about beautifully in his new book. It's not coincidental, probably, that these texts become so important during the Mamluk period. On the one hand, that's because of Cairo being the largest city in the medieval world outside of China and reaching a critical mass of who is literate and who's trafficking in text in the first place. But on the other hand, in the late Mamluk period, this is also an era in which increasingly you have conversion occurring in those rural spaces that Yossi talks about. Increasingly, you have Coptic conversion in Egypt to Islam. The 14th century is sort of viewed as a watershed moment for this. Much later than when Egypt is first brought under Muslim stewardship, which is in the 7th century.
Quite significantly later, yes.
Yes, and also the Nubian kingdoms fall by the 14th, 15th century. People make an argument sort of about how long the Nubian kingdoms kind of hold on in terms of superficial rulership to Mamluk invasion. And so Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt become quote unquote unified once again, but that's happening all during this period. And in
Yeah.
addition to that, one of the sort of global heavyweights to their south and in the Red Sea market that the Mamluks were always kind of solicitous of and concerned about just as much as their Mediterranean market, because it's how you access the Indian Ocean, and that's a pretty freaking big deal, is Solomonic Ethiopia, a major Christian kingdom.
A very powerful Christian kingdom
Major,
at the time, yeah.
powerful, and all of these groups of people, the Nubians, the Ethiopians, or Abyssinians, Habash as they were called, or Habush, I should say is the plural, as they were called in Arabic, are in what has long been considered the Bilad of Sudan, those lands of the blacks in terms of how the world is divided up into these broader sort of ethno-racial, I'm just going to keep using that clunky phrasing, formations. So again, with this concern about, blackness in domestic life that you're kind of seeing in these stories that are also about militancy, where there's a frontier of capture, of enslavement, of soldiery, and also possibly a theater of war, that's kind of all propelling at some level probably a small aspect of the market for these texts, if we can speak of there being markets for texts in this period.
Well, I mean, these texts were produced, right? And they were produced to be read and or to be consumed in some way, like as you said, like heard sometimes, right? Like so,
Yeah.
I love too, like you mentioned, like the idea of storytellers kind of renting volumes. Like it just reminds me of kind of serialization,
Yeah.
of novels and stuff like that. Like that's super super interesting. So, and it's almost like I don't know, like literature kind of matters. It helps us understand things that are happening in the world and issues of I don't know, race, class, and gender. Just to pull three things out of the top of my head, like actually help us understand kind of better things. And specialists know things about this, and we should listen to kind of specialists in particular things. Because as you've been saying, and I think that, this is not, you haven't been explicit about this, but it's been very clear, like the way that these are functioning in the Islamic world in the 12th, 13th, 14th century is different than the Islamic world earlier. It's different or Islamic world later, but also Latin Europe as well. And like, it's not a one-to-one kind of thing. It's like you said, kind of with our discussion about theory earlier, is that sometimes there are frictions and those frictions sometimes can be fruitfully resolved and sometimes they can't. And we need to listen when they can't as much as we can.
Yeah. I'm happy to be listened to.
There we go. It is always nice to be listened to. So, which is why I started a podcast. Like people listen to me. It's weird. Like I don't listen to me, and nobody should. But here we are. So
I don't disagree with that. Okay, am I allowed to ask another question that's to
you can ask a question, of course.
Okay,
Yes.
what is the listenership of this thing?
I have no idea. Like, no, that's not entirely true. So we have a vague sense is that the way that podcasts kind of work, I'm learning about this. I'm still new to this. We're still in our podcast infancy, is that there's something called unique listeners and then there's downloads. Those don't always kind of match up, right? Because some people like listen on or have multiple apps or something like that. So there's oftentimes more downloads. And then there's kind of unique clicks on the actual download. So you're actually kind of opening it. So there are, as far as I am able to tell, like people who are doing that. So I get a little bit of feedback kind of on social media and, there are numbers, there are people who are downloading this out there, which is really great. So to all of you, I raise my glass. So I figure they're mostly coming for the guests, like people like you, Rachel, rather than me. But here I am. I'm just the facilitator.
I don't know. I think you're the celebrity presence here, not not little old me. But
thank you.
I'll raise my
make
mug.
sure
How
that
about
you can raise your mug to me, and so I will mention that to my wife when I talk to her later that I was called a medieval celebrity earlier on. So it'll impress her.
Awesome.
It won't, but there we are. Anyway, on that note, we are unfortunately kind of running out of time here. We have reached about the end of our hour. So this has been a really amazing conversation. Rachel, if people do want to learn more about you or your work and they are on the internet, how might they be able to find you?
So I have, if you're interested in the stodgy academic stuff, an academia.edu page still, which you are absolutely welcome to make use of. And otherwise, you can find me at was it rachelshine.bluesky.social?
Okay, on Bluesky. So mostly that on social media. Excellent.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
And otherwise, I've yeeted all the other social media into the sun, as the kids are saying. So
there are too many social medias out there. So
yeah.
Thank you again this has been a really an amazing conversation. Thank you so much for joining us. Please go look up Rachel and her work. And other than that, thank you guys for spending some time. To those few who are downloading and you are happy about listening to my voice and as well as our guest, thank you very much. Thanks for joining us on American Medieval. We'll see you again very soon.
Thank you.
Bye. Thanks for listening to this episode of American Medieval, proud member of the Multitude Podcast Collective. I'm your host, Professor Matthew Gabriele, and this episode was edited by Julia Schifini. The theme song to American Medieval is from the song Sleeping Bags by OTE. If you'd like to support the show, get ad-free episodes, be inscribed into the Book of Life for being a kind and generous soul, and get some other neat bonus stuff, please visit us at patreon.com/AmericanMedieval. Thanks again for listening. See you all soon.